me a mic.
When I really discovered what a director does, and that is, I saw Citizen Kane on television for the first time. And I began to become aware of editing and camera positions.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Orson Welles.
So 70 years later now that these innovations have not only been understood, but they're totally absorbed by how we perceive moving image narrative and change the grammar of movies and so on. And of course, he was a wonderful magician and a great performer, great actor. None of this means anything compared to the greatness of his own movie making. Citizen Kane stands as a great enduring work of art and an overwhelmingly powerful experience physically and emotionally that gets to me every time.
Of filmmakers, you know, we're just a ragbag bunch of people doing something that is technologically already almost passé.
I grew up in Hollywood. Actually, I grew up on the beach of Santa Monica, which at that time was a private beach. Many people wonder why my father gave me the name of Christopher. He and my mother chose this name before I was born. But then when I turned out to be a girl instead of a boy, actually, that was even better because there were no girls named Christopher. And my father always liked to do the unusual thing. Although as a child I knew many people in the movie business, I didn't see them as big movie stars. And it was only years later when I remembered my childhood that I would say, oh my God, Elizabeth Taylor came over and made sand pies with me in the backyard. And then after my father married Rita Hayworth, I guess I was about maybe 5 years old then. And I was very fortunate because Rita took a big shine to me, and she liked to have me come over every weekend and spend time with her and my father. They lived not too far from us in Santa Monica. The first time I saw my father on stage, I guess I was about 5 years old, and he was putting on the Mercury Wonder Show, which was a magic show for the U.S. troops that were stationed in L.A. because we were in the war at that point, and the troops were going to be shipped out to the Pacific. So this magic show was free for the GIs, and my father put his own money into it.
That's the first time you ever saw a rabbit take a magician out of a hat.
I just think it was part of his personality, you know. To me, it goes with his love of magic. He himself was a larger-than-life person. He was first and foremost somebody who wanted to entertain you, because when he was a little boy, and I believe this was true, his mother would hold these salons, you know, and she would have all the luminaries of Chicago society would come to her home on a given evening. And my father, who was just a little boy, you know, he was told by his mother that he could come as long as he was entertaining. The moment he became boring, he had to go back to his room. So I suspect that at a very early age, my father learned to be entertaining so that he could stay up with the grown-ups, you know, and not be sent to his room.
I've never had a friend in my life who wanted to see a magic trick. You know?
Yeah. I
I don't know anybody who wants to see a magic trick. So I do it professionally. It's the only way I get to perform, you know? You know, there are people in the world who say, show us a trick, you know. I went once to a birthday party for Louis B. Mayer with a rabbit in my pocket, which I was going to take out of his hat. And on came Judy Garland and Danny Kaye and Danny Thomas and everybody you ever heard of. And then Al Jolson sang for 2 hours, and my rabbit was peeing all over me, you know. And the dawn was starting to rise over the Hillcrest Country Club as we said goodnight to Louis B. Mayer, and nobody'd asked me to do a magic trick. But the rabbit and I went home. Unsung.
What makes a good magician? He said seriously.
Seriously, what makes a good magician? He's a man who can get that rabbit out in time.
They get grainy. I haven't really done too many of them. But, you know, maybe it's really good.
In 1970, I wanted to use Orson for my first movie, A Safe Place. I flew to New York to see him. He was in a hotel at the Plaza Hotel. Peter Bogdanovich had introduced me, so I was coming thanks to Peter. And I went up the floor to go to his room, and I rang the doorbell. He opens, and he's wearing purple silk pajamas. He's enormous, like a gigantic grape, in these big purple silk pajamas. And he says, he doesn't let me in. He just opens the door and says, "What is it?" And I said, I'm Henry Jaglom. And he said, "What is that supposed to mean to me?" And I said, "Peter arranged for us to meet." He said, "About what?" And I'm still standing at the door. And I said, "About your being in my next movie." He said, "Where's the script?" I said, "I don't have a script. Can I come in, please, before we continue?" And he said, "Okay." He said, "Look, I'll sit here, but I won't listen." And he crossed his arms, looked up toward the ceiling, and refused to listen, it seemed. And I started selling and creating a character. And I remembered, reading like everybody else about his obsession with magic. So I started telling him this was a magician, and it occurred to me while I was speaking to say that he was a magician who tried to make things disappear. He made animals in the zoo disappear, but there was one thing that he couldn't make disappear. So Orson finally got interested and looked at me and said, "What? What is that?" And I said, "If you want to know, you have to do the film. Otherwise, you don't find out." And he looked at me and he said, "Can I wear a cape?" And I knew I had him.
Disappear.
I was 23 years old in 1970, and I was almost finished with my first of 3 books that I've written on Orson Welles. It was a critical study. So I went to Hollywood for the first time in 1970, and I got Peter Bogdanovich's phone number. And I called Peter, and he said, "I'm on the other line with Orson. Could you hold on?" And I said, "Oh, okay." And he came back and he said, "Orson would like to meet you." And I thought, wow, Orson is in Hollywood and he'd like to meet me. And he said, "Call him at this number tomorrow at 5:30. Welles asked Peter to recruit film buff types and filmmakers for this film he was going to do called The Other Side of the Wind. So anyway, I called Welles and he said, "We're about to start shooting a film. Would you like to be in it?" And I was flabbergasted because I'd never acted before. And the idea of being in an Orson Welles film was amazing. And all I could think of was a really stupid question. I said, "Is this going to be a feature-length film?" And Welles laughed and said, "Well, we certainly hope so." Welles went to New York in 1935, and he had the Mercury Theater with John Husband. They were involved in the Federal Theater Project, which was an attempt by the Roosevelt administration to create a national theater, which was a marvelous thing. And they did a lot of plays that were very successful on Broadway. And Welles was making great strides in the radio at the time, and they had a Mercury Theater on the Air radio series. And he was a very popular radio actor. He had a great voice, of course, and so he was doing radio all the time, making a lot of money off it, and started directing plays. In 1936, when he was 21, he directed the Black Macbeth, or the Voodoo Macbeth, for the Federal Theater's Negro Theater Project. And this, by all accounts, was an amazing production. There's even a 4-minute clip that exists that you could see. The newsreel company filmed it.
The Negro Theater Unit of the Federal Theater Project produced a highly successful version of Shakespeare's immortal tragedy Macbeth, which far exceeded its scheduled run in New York and was later sent on a tour of the country. The scene was changed from Scotland to Haiti, but the spirit of Macbeth and every line in the play has remained intact. In this contribution to the American theater and in other projects under the Works program, we have set our feet on the road toward a brighter future.
And it was an amazing achievement for, can you imagine a young guy directing an all-black cast, at that age? So he was a world-famous guy by the time he was 21 or 22. He was on the cover of Time magazine when he was 23, which was the height of celebrity in those days.
I used to go by ambulance from one radio station to another because I discovered there was no law in New York that you had to be sick to travel in an ambulance. So I hired the ambulance and I would go from CBS to NBC. They'd hold an elevator for me. I'd go up to the 5th floor, go into the studio, whichever I was booked for. I'd say, what's the character? They'd say, 80-year-old Chinaman. And I'd go on and do the 80-year-old Chinaman and then rush off somewhere else.
My father made this incredible radio broadcast, The War of the Worlds, which rocked the nation and which made him famous around the world almost overnight. When he made the War of the Worlds broadcast that caused the national panic, that made him, there were headlines all over the world about this broadcast.
It was at the time of the Munich crisis when the whole world was on edge because they thought war could break out at any moment. They were used to radio broadcasts about, dangers of war in Europe, and so Wells did it like a radio broadcast, a news broadcast.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
A bulletin is handed me. Martian cylinders are falling all over the country. The enemy is now in sight above the Palisades. Five great machines.
He would have this band playing and then interrupt for announcements, and he had a newscaster who sounded like President Roosevelt, and it seemed believable in a sense, although you listen to it today, it seems fairly preposterous. I've met people who listened to it and said they believed the story the Martians were attacking. A lot of people were running out in the streets and driving up in the hills, and some woman ran into a police station in San Francisco with her clothes all ripped up and claiming the Martians had attacked her and things like that.
The moment that terrified the people was silence. Orson was standing in the middle of the studio, and the radio announcer, the newsman, said, "Oh my God, it's coming closer, it's closer, closer." Ah! Silence. And Orson stood in the middle of the studio going, and he held the silence for a long time. And that's when everybody got scared. So interesting, silence scared the people more than anything else. And Orson knew that would happen, I guess. He claimed that he didn't know it was going to be such a reaction, but I think he did know.
There is a funny newsreel footage taken the morning after the event where he's giving a press conference and he's expressing regret. And it's all a big act because he didn't regret anything. He was just saying that because they were worried they might get sued or even he or other people could get arrested or something. But the whole thing kind of blew over.
Of course, we are deeply shocked and deeply regretful about the results of last night's broadcast.
I said to him, "Do you feel any regrets about the War of the Worlds?" And what I meant was that it was like too prominent in his story. And he said, "Regret? What is there to regret?"
People believed anything they heard on the radio. And I said, let's do something impossible and make them believe it. And then show them that it's only radio. So that was what started it. And then, of course, they passed a lot of laws. Now you can't do it. You can't give a news broadcast, say this is the news without all that. But the people who tried it in other countries were all put in jail. And I got a contract, Hollywood. It really is the truth.
So then Hollywood became very interested in getting Orson Welles to go out to the West Coast, and they wanted him to do in a movie what he had done on the radio.
So when he came to make Citizen Kane, he got this amazing contract from RKO. Wells had to get story approval and cast approval from RKO, and he had to do it within certain budgets. But he did have final cut, which was very unusual. He had been getting offers from studios. Before that, he'd even done a couple of screen tests for Warner Brothers and Selznick, but they were offering him conventional deals as an actor and all that, and he wanted really full control, which he got with Citizen Kane, pretty full control. So he was resisting Hollywood's offers, but the War of the Worlds led to RKO making him an extraordinary offer of 3-picture deal with a lot of autonomy. And RKO was a studio that had just emerged from bankruptcy, and they were taking chances on arty filmmakers. They were letting people like John Ford and Howard Hawks and other people make pet projects. And so George Schaefer, the president, was a rather enlightened studio executive who thought it'd be good for the studio and prestigious to have Orson Welles make films.
There was a tremendous resentment from, of course, because nowadays every star has directed a movie. Even the TV stars direct some of their segments. It's perfectly normal for actors to direct themselves. But nobody had done that since von Stroheim, and it was unheard of. And then that I should be the author and absolute producer. Now, of course, the producers hated me most, because if I could do all those things, then what is the need for a producer?
When Wells was shooting Citizen Kane, he was naive about a couple things. One was that he thought the director did all the lighting, because in the theater, the director is very involved in the lighting. So he hired the great Greg Toland, who was the greatest cameraman who ever lived, probably. And Wells was going around lighting everything. And Toland, he said, was such a gentleman and nice fellow that he told the crew, just don't say anything about it. And they let Wells do this for a few days. And Toland would go around, touch the crew guy on the shoulder and tell him to move the lights a little bit. And then he told Wells, this is really my job. And Wells was really embarrassed. But Toland said, no, it's okay. He said he wanted to work with Wells because he had never directed a film before. Actually, he said, I thought I could learn from you because of your ignorance,
I wish we could have a light. You see how that light on your booster, the color tram, makes a reflection on the light. I wish we could move it so it makes a reflection.
In an interview Orson gave, he was asked who his favorite directors were, and he said, well, I'm partial to the old masters, by which I mean John Ford, and John Ford. With Ford at his best, you get a sense of what the earth is made of, even if the script is by Mother McCree. So I showed that quote to Ford. He looked at it and he said, where is Orson? I said, I think he's at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Mm-hmm. Next day I got a call from Orson. Did you show that quote of mine to Ford? I said, yeah, why? He said, I just got a telegram. Thanks for the compliment. Love, Mother McCree.
Then another awful moment came when I didn't understand directions. And that was because I had learned how to make movies by running Stagecoach every night for a month. Because if you will look at Stagecoach, you will see that the Indians attack left to right, and then they attack right to left, and so on. In other words, there's no direction followed. Every rule is broken in the picture. And I sat and watched it 45 times. So, of course, when I was suddenly told in an over-shoulder shot that I had to look camera left instead of camera right, I said no, because I was standing here. That argument, So we closed the picture down. And about 2 in the afternoon, and went back to my house, and Toland showed me how that worked. And I said, well, God, there's a lot of stuff here I don't know. And he said, there's nothing I can't teach you in 3 hours.
I know you're tired, gentlemen, but I brought you here for a reason. I think this little pilgrimage will do us good.
Chronicle's a good newspaper.
The Chronicle's a good idea for a newspaper. Notice the circulation.
495,000. But Mr. Kane, look who's working for the Chronicle. With them fellas, it's no trick to get circulation.
You're right, Mr. Bernstein.
You know how long it took the Chronicle to get that staff together? 20 years.
20 years. Well, 6 years ago, I looked at a picture of the world's greatest newspaper men. I felt like a kid in front of a candy store. Well, tonight, 6 years later, I got my candy. All of it. Welcome, gentlemen, to the Inquirer.
That's all.
Make up an extra copy of that picture and send it to the Chronicle, will you, please? It'll make you all happy to learn that our circulation this morning was the greatest in New York, 684,000.
684,132.
Right.
He opened up cinema to a whole new idea of what you could do. That's true. He and his cinematographer, Greg Toland, did an extraordinary thing visually that had not been done before. That certainly had an effect. But there had already been in Germany the whole expressionist filmmaking of Ufa, and that's not what it was. It was the freshness in American cinema, the freshness of vision, the freshness of expression, the willingness not to play by all the conventional rules of how a movie is supposed to look and what the timing is and so on, that gave everybody who wanted to be a filmmaker the freedom they thought they wanted to make films their own way.
I mean, first there was the official recognition of, new ways of telling story, innovations in storytelling and cinematography. The fact that Wells was 25 years old and came out of theater, of course, and radio, and changed the grammar of movies and so on. But then later in the 50s, you really saw the effect the picture had on other movies. Not so much, they talk about seeing ceilings for the first time. That wasn't that unusual, but it was the extremely low angles, for example. And that's what really drew the attention to the ceilings. Texture of the images. But overall, the story, the feeling of loss, a hero who is really defined by, surprisingly, what he doesn't have.
Cut. That's great. Cut. Cut. What's he still running? Cut. Well, why are you still holding it? You must get tired. It keeps on. Ready?
Yes, ready.
Camera. Scene 6, take 2. Action.
Literally, he was not afraid of being self-conscious with the camera and making self-referential remarks with the camera, and literally letting the audience understand, yes, the camera is looking through the floor up into the ceiling. And I began noticing camera movement because he used that wide-angle lens a great deal. And if you use a wider-angle lens and you move quick enough, you see the walls speeding past you. And this is what I think Wells brought to cinema, to American cinema particularly, because up to that time, it was the seamless film, in a way. The hidden camera, the camera that you couldn't tell was there. So Wells was the one to really open up the Pandora's box of cameras flying up. And the odd thing about the picture, and I've seen it countless times, the enigma of it is Kane himself. You don't know him. You can't get to know him. I can't really feel for him as much as I did in the beginning. But in the beginning, when I first saw the film many times, I was feeling more for Orson Welles himself, acting in the film. I liked him personally. Citizen Kane was the picture where everything was in balance and, where he worked in harmony with that system, where he had everything he needed. And, of course, there was the excitement over the scandalous side of the picture, the connections with William Randolph Hearst.
Wells was trying to make some anti-fascist films, and he was going to transpose it to America and have a businessman with fascistic tendencies. So he was going after Howard Hughes, and then he went after William Randolph Hearst.
And because Hearst raised a huge fuss about it and made sure that it would not be shown in any movie theaters in the country that were under Hearst's management, the movie was just dead in the water. And the next venture, which was Magnificent Ambersons, again, that film just didn't do well with the public. And so the studio actually took it out of my father's hands and reshot the ending and made all kinds of changes, which from my father's point of view just ruined the movie. I mean, as far as he was concerned, it wasn't his film anymore.
It was thought by everybody in Hollywood while I was in South America that it was too downbeat, famous Hollywood word at the time, downbeat. So it was all taken out, but it was the purpose of the movie.
They had 2 bad previews of Ambersons, terrible previews. And the studio panicked and just cut it to shreds. And Orson was way down in Rio and couldn't come to the rescue.
But with a budget of $1 million, I was sent to Rio to make up a movie about the carnival. Now, I don't like things like carnivals and Mardi Gras and all that, but I was told that it was my patriotic duty. They put it to me that it would be a real contribution to inter-American affairs in the Latin American world and so on. So
the picture was destroyed except the first hour is pretty much the way Orson had it. And then this last half hour is very much recut and reshot.
And they started cutting it. They actually shot the last. There are 3 scenes at the end I didn't even write or shoot.
The fact that the first hour is so good that the movie is still a masterpiece in some ways is amazing. But that hurt him even more than the financial failure of Citizen Kane, because Ambersons was a failure too. Even though it got an Academy Award nomination, it didn't do well. Those 2 things were pretty much the kiss of death.
You're not wanted in this house, Mr. Morgan.
Afraid I don't understand.
She'll understand this.
The Magnificent Ambersons brings you many of the Mercury players you first saw in Citizen Kane. It brings you Orson Welles as commentator, director, and producer of a truly distinguished and exciting motion picture.
And they butchered the end of the film. From then on, he couldn't get, he never got complete control. He never had the final cut again, and none of his films made money. None of them.
I never recovered from that attack. So the fact that they had promised me when I went to South America that they would send a moviola and cutters to me, and that I would finish the cutting of Ambersons there. They never did. They cut it themselves. So they destroyed Ambersons, and the picture itself destroyed me. I didn't get a job as a director for years afterwards.
In America, he never had a hit. He never had a box office success, except for a picture he didn't like called The Stranger. He didn't like that film, but it was the only picture of his that made any money in America.
The Stranger was a film that Welles said was a commercial enterprise. The one time he tried to make a film just to be commercial and popular, because he hadn't been able to direct a film since The Magnificent Ambersons. It's all true.
Franz.
And the next picture I did do was The Stranger. And I did that to show people that I didn't glow in the dark. You know, that I could say action and cut just like all the other fellows.
Welles wasn't satisfied with it, and he had to accept a lot of things that the producer wanted him to do. He wanted, for example, Agnes Moorehead to play the investigator who's hunting down this fugitive Nazi who's escaped to America, played by Welles. That was too unconventional for them, so they cast Edward G. Robinson.
Well, then you have no faith in the reforms that are being effected in Germany.
Well, I don't know, Mr. Wilson. I can't believe that people can be reformed except from within. The basic principles of equality and freedom never have, never will take root in Germany. The will to freedom has been voiced in every other tongue. All men are created equal, liberté, égalité, fraternité, but in German...
There's Marx. Proletarians unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains.
But Marx wasn't a German, Marx was a Jew.
This guy is such an obvious villain, and the point of the film is that all these Americans are very naive, and they don't realize that this guy is in their midst, who's obvious to everybody as this villain, and that's the point of the film. It was also the first commercial American film that showed concentration camp footage.
Gas chamber, Mrs. Rankin. The candidates were first given hot showers so that their pores would be open and the gas would act that much more quickly.
And Welles was very seriously concerned after the war about neo-Nazism. He wrote articles about it, and like other people, he realized that, U.S. government was working with Nazis, using them as spies and rocket scientists and things like that. And so a lot of people who were guilty in the war were getting off. And then the Vatican was helping Nazis escape to South America, and Welles was one of the people who thought this was a bad situation, so he was trying to alert the public to that. He was married 3 times, but he did talk about Rita Hayworth a lot. He loved Rita Hayworth, his second wife, who was the big sex symbol of the times, and he saw her on a magazine cover and said, "I'm going to marry that woman."
And we had wonderful, wonderful times together. She was a perfect stepmother because she was almost like a child herself. I don't think she really liked being a movie star. And of course, as many movie stars discovered, people fell in love with who they were on the screen. And then when they met them in real life, they were often disappointed because it wasn't the glamorous person. And And Rita was famous for saying, men went to bed with Gilda, but then they woke up with me. When I was a little girl growing up in Hollywood, and all the people I knew were in the movies, and I thought that's what I should do. I should also be in the movies. I just assumed that was my future. So I was constantly pestering my father to put me in one of his movies, and he was basically ignore it. He did not want me to become an actress, and I am now very grateful for that. But at the time, I really thought that's what I should do, so I didn't give him any peace at all. I think at one point he was filming part of Lady of Shanghai in Acapulco in Mexico, and so my mother sent me down there to stay with him for a couple of weeks. And so I was there. They were mostly doing the scenes on the yacht. Errol Flynn had loaned my father his yacht, and most of the shooting was taking place in Acapulco Bay. And then at one point, they finally moved their location from the yacht to this dusty road somewhere in the town. And I saw that as my opportunity to get into the movie. So I ran up to my father and I said, "Oh, please, please let me be in the movie." And so he looked down at me in total exasperation and he said, "All right, you can be a brat eating an ice cream cone." Well, you know, that really wasn't the role I had in mind, but I was ready to do anything. So I said, okay. And that satisfied me for a while. I thought, okay, great. I got in the movie. Well, of course, I wasn't in the movie at all because either there was no film in the camera, which is probably what happened, or if they did film it, they just cut it out in the editing room. But at least for the moment, I was convinced that I was also in the movie with Daddy and Rita.
Mrs. Bannister, can you think of any reason why your husband would want to hire a divorce detective other than to watch you?
I object! As a matter of fact, you and Michael O'Hara have kissed each other, haven't you? To name one occasion, you were seen in the aquarium of this city kissing each other. Do you deny that?
It stars his ex-wife, Rita Hayworth, who he had already separated from, and they were still friends. And it was only because she was a big star at Columbia that he got to make this film. She was being supportive of him. But she had this beautiful set of red hair that was her trademark, and Wells made a point of cutting her hair short and dyeing it blonde. And he said he did it just to be, you know, make her different for the film, not her usual thing. But it was seen as an attack on Columbia and Harry Cohn and Rita Hayworth. And there are people who claim that the film is a misogynistic attack on his ex-wife and everything because she plays a villainous.
She came to me and said, "I want to make your picture. I want you to come back with me." So the theory, which has been printed 1,000 times, that this was an act of vengeance against Rita, that it was a great device which I was going to degrade her and so on, is nonsense because all that's in the book. She'd read the book and wanted to play this character, show she was an actress.
I think my father was a pioneer because he was, I believe, he was one of the first, certainly in this country, to work outside of the studio system and to finance his movies with his own money. You know, he would work as an actor to earn money, which he would then put back into his film.
One of the films that Wells is most associated with is The Third Man, which he didn't direct. Some people look at it and they think, well, he must have directed parts of it because it looks like a Wells film, but really it was directed by Carol Reed. He did a lot of Wellesian angles and shadows and things, but that was his style, and Wells never claimed that he directed any of it, and he made it very clear he did not. And it's a very Wellesian story because it's about one friend betraying the other for legitimate reason, but it's a bitter story. And Wells said that in Europe, every time he walked into a nightclub or a restaurant, the orchestra or the piano player would start playing the Third Man theme. And it began to bother him and drive him crazy because, I mean, he didn't direct the film. And so he was known best for a film he didn't do.
I never argue about the direction, but I usually come up with a rewritten scene. That's the headache they have to put up with. And then if they don't like it, I'll go back to the other. But I go back home at night and write next day's scene, hope they'll take it instead of what it is. But I never would tell a director, would you do that or something, unless they asked me.
People wonder why my father fell from favor in Hollywood, you know, why he arrived as the boy genius, and then suddenly he was the enfant terrible and nobody would work with him. At that point in my father's career, it was very difficult for him to get a studio to back his movies because none of his movies had made money, and in Hollywood, only movies that make money are appreciated. And nobody really wanted art films. There was no audience for an art movie in the United States, unfortunately. So I think that was really the beginning of the end for my father in terms of Hollywood. And I think this is why he began to look to Europe as a place to go where he could maybe have artistic control over his films.
There was once in Venice a Moor or fellow who, for his merits in the affairs of war, was held in great esteem. It happened that he fell in love with a young and noble lady called Desdemona.
A sweet woman. I'll chop her into messes. Tackle me.
You know, he didn't make a lot of films in Europe, but they were good films and they were his films. He said, maybe my films would have been better, but they wouldn't have been mine. And that's the thing. Mr. Arcadin has a lot of flaws, but it's a very fascinating film, and it's his film. Nobody else could have made it. It's a very unusual film. And Othello, the same. And those documentaries he made, and The Trial. And then Chimes of Midnight, I think, is his greatest film. It's a wonderful movie.
A kind of personality which requires that I play certain kinds of parts, or I discombobulate the scene. And that's, it's a kind of handicap. There used to be a form, a division of actors in France, in the Comédie Française, who were called king actors. They weren't necessarily the best actor, they were the actor who played the king, you know? And I'm a king actor, maybe a bad one, but that's what I am, you see.
My father is a Shakespearean character because he combined so many of Shakespeare's characters, but he also, some of his greatest acting roles were as Macbeth, as Othello, and I think especially as Falstaff. I think that role was made for him, and I can't see him in that role without crying. He's so moving, especially in that scene where the prince, you know, scorns him. That still moves me to tears, that scene.
My king! My Jove! I speak to thee, my heart.
I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers. How ill white hairs become a fool and jester. I have long dreamed of such a kind of man, so surfeit-swelled, so old, and so profane. But being awaked, I do despise my dream.
You're my favorite picture yet. If I wanted to get into heaven on the basis of one movie, I would. That's the one I would offer up. I think it's because it is, to me, the least flawed. Let me put it that way. It is the most successful for what I tried to do. I succeeded more completely, in my view, with that than with anything else.
He kept trying to make a movie that would be successful, but it seems like, you know, just as King Midas, everything he touched turned to gold, everything my father touched turned to art, and often Gothic art, and things that the American public couldn't really understand. And I have people to this day coming up to me and saying, you know, I'm told that Citizen Kane is the greatest movie that was ever made, but you know, quite frankly, I don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't see why people think it's the greatest movie ever made. Whereas in Europe, he's revered. Much more than in his own country. I've always seen that as such an irony.
Over the years, Wells became known on the official record by a lot of people. It became known as a failure and a has-been, Kane was supposedly the one lasting achievement. But for us, the filmmakers, we didn't know any of that. It was a very, very different story. I had seen a number of other Wells pictures around the same time, including the Shakespeare films, Macbeth, Othello. For us, Wells was a lighthouse, a beacon of the individual, the individuality, of a commitment to yourself and to your art above everything else. Everything else. And yes, people said he was self-destructive. I guess one can say that, and maybe some say he acted in too many commercials and mediocre films, but he had to survive during that period, no matter how many compromises or cuts or constraints in the pictures. One just has to look at Chimes of Midnight and whatever version one can find of Mr. Our Garden to know that. He put a lot of that money into films that he had to complete over a period of time, Othello and a number of others. When I saw Touch of Evil, for example, for many years I saw the studio version. It's still a great film.
Starring this outstanding cast: Charlton Heston, Janet Leigh, Orson Welles.
I talked to Charlton Heston about Touch of Evil, and he was the guy. He deserves a lot of credit from all of us who love Welles, because that Welles would not have gotten to direct Touch of Evil without Heston. It was based on a novel called Badge of Evil, which is a pretty good novel, actually, and they were going to just have some studio director do it, and they wanted Welles to play the bad guy, Hank Quinlan, the corrupt police captain, and they offered it to Charlton Heston, and they mentioned something about Welles hopefully playing the other part, and Heston said, well, who's going to direct it? And they said, well, we don't know yet, and Heston said, well, what about Orson Welles? He's a pretty good director, you know. And Heston said it was as if I had mentioned maybe my mother should direct the film. You know, they were horrified. But they said, we'll get back to you, because he was a big star. And then they said, okay, you know. And so Welles was allowed to direct this film.
What are you trying to do?
We're trying to strap you in the electric chair, Boyd.
You framed that boy.
Framed him! Oh, God, now. I'm a husband. What did you do with her?
So that was his return to Hollywood after 11 years. And he said when they saw the final version, up to that point they had been very supportive, but they were horrified at the film because it's a very dark, nightmarish, scary film.
Hold her legs.
And then everything changed, and they barred him from the cutting room, and they brought in another cutter to start messing around with the film, and another director came in and shot 15 minutes of footage. And so once again, a Welles film was not released in the form he wanted it to.
Because they loved the rushes. Every day, the head of the studio came to me and wanted me to come to the office and sign a deal for several pictures, and it's great stuff. Then they saw a rough cut of it, and they were so horrified that they wouldn't let me in the studio. And nobody's ever explained what horrified them. The last thing they wanted was a success, and nobody has ever explained it to me. Chuck Heston doesn't know. They never told him. They certainly never told me. We don't know what it is. It was too dark for them, too strange, I think. I don't think we would have had that reaction now. They're a little too tough, a little too black. But that's a guess. I just don't know.
The truth is, he made 8 or 9 or 10, I don't know, magnificent movies, some of them. Falstaff. It's, I think, the greatest film of anything to do with Shakespeare ever made. It's a masterpiece. Nobody talks about it. In America, absolutely nobody mentions it ever. And I love F for Fake. He recreates film in a new way. So he didn't get the support, the acclaim that he had gotten so spoiled with at 24 years or 25 years of age. And that's why he would say something like the rest of his life he should have done something else.
I made essentially a mistake in staying in movies, but it's the mistake I can't regret, because it's like saying I shouldn't have stayed married to that woman, but I did because I love her. I would have been more successful if I hadn't been married to her, I would have been more successful if I'd left movies immediately. Stayed in the theater, gone into politics, written anything. I've wasted the greater part of my life looking for money and trying to get along, trying to make my work from this terribly expensive paint box, which is a movie. And I've spent too much energy on things that have nothing to do with making a movie. It's about 2% movie making and 98% hustling. It's no way to spend a life.
Do you feel that's going to go on?
Oh, I'm going to go on being faithful to my girl. I love her.
But the truth was, this was his calling. This is what he had to do. And through bad and good days and through some very difficult years, he kept trying till his very death to make movies. That's all he really wanted to do, make movies. He died, you know, with this, because he couldn't sit up, because he was so big. He died with his typewriter on his belly, writing a movie. So, I mean, his life was about trying to get another movie made, another movie made. So whatever he said about wishing that he had had some other life, he couldn't have had any other life. This was who he was.
When I met him, he was working on F for Fake, and he was also trying to finish Merchant of Venice, which he never did finish. But then he decided to make The Other Side of the Wind, and he used his own money to start with. He shot for about 4 or 5 years, really, off and on. He shot in my house when I got a big house in Bel Air. He moved in and was there while I was in Europe making a film. Well, he shot that film, finished shooting the film. He never was able to finish editing it. At a lunch we had sometime, in the mid-70s, he turned to me suddenly and he said, "If anything ever happens to me, I want you to promise me you'll finish the picture." I said, "Orson, why would anything happen to you? What a terrible thing to bring up. Nothing's going to happen to you." He said, "I know, but if it does, I want you to promise me you'll finish the picture."
I think somehow, you know, like many great men, they have a sense, they know that they're great. They know that they will live beyond their time. And I think my father, he knew that. And that consoled him in a way. Because I remember once we were having one of our long phone conversations, and I told him how upset I was that nobody would give him the money to finish The Other Side of the Wind or the other projects that he had. And he said to me, "Don't you worry about me, darling girl. They're going to love me when I'm dead."
Remember. Make a wish, maybe. Remember. Now, open your eyes and open your hands.
I made 3 films. One I acted in, The Other Side of the Wind. One he acted in my first movie, A Safe Place. And he acted in his last movie, Someone to Love. I said to him one day, "Orson, I want you to look in the camera and say, 'Remember.'" And Orson said to me, "An actor never looks into the camera." And then he started making a bargain with me. He said, "Well, you keep saying that's okay after I do 1 or 2 takes. I never feel you're going to pick the right take anyway, because you're not me. And I want to be able to go 20 takes, 30 takes if necessary." I said, "Okay, I'll make a deal with you. You can do as many as you want," I said to him, "and you tell me which are the best 2. And I'll make a note, these are Orson's favorite ones." He said, they'll let you do that? You can do that? I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you want in return?" I said, "I want you to do what I ask, like look in the camera when you say you don't. I want you not to tell the other actors what to do," because he started telling them. I said, "I want you not to direct." He started telling, "That's the wrong place for the camera, and put the lights over here." I said, "Orson, none of that. In return, all the takes you want." And he said, "It's a deal." You know, and he was so cooperative, and he never needed more than 2 or 3 takes. But he felt insecure, and he starts with "Remember."
In my I'm sorry. You blew me. He broke up and broke me up.
End sticks on 296.
That clever idea of doing many of them went to hell.
End sticks on 293.
I was only good for one. It was one shot.
His last acting performance was in my movie, Someone to Love. I said, "I need you to sit in the back of the theater and talk and answer questions from me, the young director, to you, the older director." He said, "Okay." I said, "But I need you to do what you just said, Orson, to be who you are, as yourself. No makeup, no accents, no noses, the real you." He said, "Oh, great, that's just once in my life." And then he showed up, and I said, "Orson, is that you?" Because he had this makeup, he said, "I'm Greek. I'm a Greek. Do you like that?" I said, "What are you talking about, Greek? We had this whole discussion about the reason you want to be in the movie. to show who you are. Oh, you don't like this? He said, come back in an hour. I came back in an hour. He did a different makeup, Egyptian, with an accent and another nose. I said, no. I said, Orson. And he wanted me to keep, because I couldn't change Orson. He needed to play this game till I finally said, Orson, I'm not doing this unless you, no noses, no voices, you on screen, for the first time completely as who you are. He said, with this little nose? I said, yes, with that little nose.
I have a terrible feeling that because I'm speaking to you from the back of the theater, and because I have a white beard, you may expect me to give you the truth about something. I'm speaking from the cheap seats, not from Mount Sinai.
I'm on Someone to Love. At the end of the film, he turned to the cameraman and he said, cut. And the cameraman cuts. And I ran over, I said, what are you doing? And he said, Orson Welles told me to cut. What am I supposed to do? So I said, oh, okay. And I flicked the camera back on. Orson didn't know it was back on. And Orson started to laugh and started to laugh and laughed bigger and bigger. And as he was doing it, I was thinking, I've got it. I don't know what I'm going to do because he's not going to let me put this in the picture. But this would be the perfect ending because he's laughing like at 50 years of all the problems. It's giving him what we call the last laugh.
Don't I need a finish?
No.
Could I kill everyone else?
By this time, the credits are rolling down, and the audience, such as it may be, is on its way up the aisle. As far as this movie is concerned, it seems to me you've got your ending.
Why?
Because we have come to the end.
I'm glad you came today.
So am I.
Thank you. Stay a little
we
longer?
We really can't go on recording this.
Why?
It's got too sweet.
I'm not going to say cut.
I'll say cut. I'm a director.
Say
cut.